Hello everyone, today we talk about war and liturgy in the early Middle Ages. So this is the first video of a series that I'm starting doing together with the other topics that is expressly dedicated to chivalry, and the concept of chivalry chiefly actually between the ancient world and roughly the Crusades. So it's nothing that looks beyond temporally. Naturally, on Schwerpunkt, I will extensively discuss about chivalry also in later times. But this is really aimed at looking at what the chivalry we know of in the later Middle Ages, in the low Middle Ages, and really formed, and what its meaning was. Because I got interested into it recently, at least some couple of years ago, and I decided, and like a new world completely opened to me, because it's not strictly about military history, but even though I consider this video also about military history in many ways, but it takes into consideration many other, especially ideological, cultural, anthropological, religious meanings that really are the ones that that made it chivalry the one we know, and that still so heavily influences our behavior today. And although we are very secular and modern in our world, we still resent very much of medieval ethics, and and that dates back, however, much far back than that, as during the Middle Ages chivalry emerged as something codified, let's say, but previously there are roots that really look very very far and wide, and people sometimes think that, excuse me for coughing, that, I don't know, the chivalry something was born sometime around the time of the Crusades or right before, right? This is something that doesn't make sense, and then people identify, oh well, yeah, because there was this influence also from other civilizations, etc. But this is really something that dates straight back to the Indo-European origins of Europe, and and this is difficult to make it understand. Of course, in part because it's a chapter that we have completely forgotten. Who does think about the Indo-Europeans? Most of the people guess about, yeah, there was some influence, but those were like the very primitives, like, right, that have something to do with our current Western identity. It's mostly was developed later. We look at Greece and Rome and as feudal Europe as the moments that gave you know, the the cast to say that casted our culture. It's really not like that. I mean, all these Greece, Rome, and feudal Europe, etc., were all part of the same product. It also gets on my nerves when people want to distinguish, I don't know, Germans and the Celts from the Romans and the Greeks, because as if those were two radically different things. They weren't, as a matter of fact. The origins were the same. Also, part of the greatest part of their culture was actually the same. Even if they were transformed, even if they didn't rationalize that, but they still felt there was much in common. Latin is extremely similar to Celtic. The Indo-European religions are all out there, essentially all the same meanings, all the same, even the same figures, the same words sometimes, and our languages as well. But aside from this, let's stick to liturgy now, and let's try to give a look at how this is not strictly about the Indo-European origins. This has mostly to do with history of Christianity, but it also looks partly at certain specific contexts. So why liturgy? I mean, war and liturgy sound two very different things. Well, there's really a lot to discuss about this. So when we start, just put it in this way, when we study the history of thought, and we are interested in studying war from a theoretical point of view, in political theory, etc., we kind of say, oh well, yeah, there were a bunch of thinkers, mostly Christians, and some of the greatest figures of the late antique world that thought about it and wrote it, and so had a large influence on what came after. And then at a certain point, the early Middle Ages start, and a broad theological thinking, political theory is getting once again revived only in the lower Middle Ages, right? And what happens in the middle is kind of a dark hole that nobody really takes into consideration. And this is partly true if we want to brutally approximate what happens. Naturally, it's an approximation because there were great thinkers and a huge deal of political theory being developed during the early Middle Ages, but complexively, given the sheer size of the phenomenon, yeah, we can't say something similar. Also, because during the early Middle Ages, especially the authorities that were over which political theories were developed were actually very few. In the lower Middle Ages, the Europeans began to have a lot more models and of sources to deal with, always looking back at their past, and this doesn't mean that without that past they would have been incapable of doing anything. On the contrary, if you look at medieval political theory, you realize how the medievals were extremely autonomous thinkers. Even if they attributed a central fundamental importance to the authority, chiefly naturally the Christian authority. But not only, because there were certain models that came straight from the Roman Empire, for instance, that today we'll see that were essentially Christianized over time, but still, were in part just adapted from a pagan world. And the point I was making before is that medieval Europe still had a vein of paganism, very strong vein of paganism, even when these guys were fully Christianized. So really, there is nothing wrong about that. It's cultural, and it actually made the whole picture much richer and more interesting. So we have a problem though for the early Middle Ages, because when we want to study the theory of war, we find essentially much less evidence than especially all these great theologians and thinkers that existed in previous times during the late antique era were essentially not there anymore. And so we have to look at other sources that are, however, equally important sometimes, or that, let's say, have been widely overlooked, and then instead tell us really so much. And there is also another point to make, that is that the great theologians and thinkers sometimes, they are geniuses, but they don't tell it all. I mean, they try to make it a theoretical point. Anyway, not abstract, but still that has a high degree of abstraction for mythological reasons, chiefly. So sometimes, even in those previous times, we have difficulties to look at what the feelings of the masses, or at least the prevalent perceptions, they say at an average level, actually were. So, talking about the liturgies, this is instead something that goes beyond to the clerical elites, and we're talking essentially about a sort of dialogue, a conversation, a meeting in some way between God and his people. That is the liturgy, in fact. The liturgy can tell us really a lot about what, especially now we will talk about war, but also a lot about lots of other things, and we can say about politics and society. Because if you want to understand war and to want to be a military historian, you can't avoid to to understand politics and society, because that's you just have a ramp if you take war by itself. You can't fully understand it. So the liturgy is has many interesting characteristics, even from a strictly historical point of view. First of all, liturgy is very peremptory in its clarity. It's something that has to state a reality in many ways, and that also makes you understand why it can be used as such a powerful political tool, for instance. And as modern people, we have a lot of troubles, even if, I don't know, maybe we are religious, to understand how really this peremptory clarity was felt at the time. Today we are much more skeptical about it. It doesn't matter how much we believe. The worlds we are talking about, especially here in the early medieval times, were definitely something into which liturgy had a crucial role in defining the people's mindset, etc. Also because, by the way, it was one of the few things that the people actually heard at that time from religion, because and they saw from religion as well. Liturgy has this very powerful visual dimension as well. Because most people obviously didn't read, so all they could understand about their religion was in part related to even these exterior rites. There were certain areas of Europe that naturally remained more close to the written practice, others that basically start to know it only at this time through evangelization. Now we'll see the various examples, but mostly, however, most of the people really attributed to liturgy this liturgy represented for most of the people this medium between God and the world that was a bit unique in its kind. It even probably went for some beyond the scriptures, simply because they couldn't read them, and they could only hear them in this sense. So aside from this theoretical thing, we must say that liturgy as a historical source is very difficult to handle, because first of all, it varied from place to place, so and from time to time. This is very important to bear in mind. So it's very difficult to categorize, but at the same time it's helpful because it shows you what the differences were, and those differences are always very, very meaningful. Secondly, there is another problem in liturgy that has to do with the tradition, that is from derivation. So not everything that you read about a liturgy from one time is something that obviously was created at that time. There was a big deal of tradition involved, so that there were certain models, certain contents that naturally remained since the very first Christian liturgies that we own, and we can easily check that philologically speaking. So it's very important, however, to not underestimate the role of liturgy in this sense for the local communities. So this connection between the very harsh truth of faith. I'm saying harsh. I should say hard, because the truth of faith is it's very hard. It's not simple. Christianity is not something really comforting. Christianity has a sort of etheric tension. I mean, it's something that really puts you on on the stage. I mean, you have to take action. It's not something simple. It's not something comforting. I mean, it's comforting if you are able, but especially into these early medieval times, also even the prevalent attitude towards Christianity was, as it's often said, especially in history of philosophy, this idea that was a more of a fear of God than actually a of his wrath and his and of divine justice than the more humanistic approach that starts taking place especially from the 12th century onwards. So there's a very dramatic content in Christianity. Think about the Passion. Think about there are many words that Christ used that were quite violent. He states he was coming with a sword, basically to tear the world apart, literally. So these were all metaphors actually that impressed very much people who saw this, who lived in the early Middle Ages and were living therefore in a world that was very violent, very troubled, and that in this sense, and of which Christianity could really interpret part of its deeper veins in many ways. So liturgy is important as much as, for instance, the sacred architecture. I mean, churches were not built just like for practical. There is an architecture that really symbolizes an interpretation of the scriptures, a view of the world that is based on it, and the evolution of it has definitely also a great meaning in the history of thought, and should always be looked at to understand what the community of the believers actually lived and thought like at the time. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. Good fresh water. Okay. So, so liturgy goes in parallel, transforms in parallel with the history of society, and this is pretty self-evident. So we have now let's start to do a history of these liturgies. So the first liturgical lessons that we can identify with clarity also from a philological point of view are the ones contained in the so-called Sacramentarium Leonianum. So we this is a very old text. So we are essentially talking about this was excuse me, written down, compiled, let's say, as a form, because this is the point, the Sacramentarium Leonianum is something that was created, through the sum of various traditions that came from previous centuries, but our first compilation actually comes from the 6th century. And however, it's something that pertains to a more to an older world. These prayers and rites that are elaborated into it date back essentially to the 4th and 5th century. So the very first centuries after the Constantinian times. So a moment into which the Christian community was doing something very important. It was stressing the full agreement, the full alliance, let's say, between church and state. So these traditions wanted essentially to stress the loyalty of the Christians towards the emperor, because these were centuries in which there were or still pagans. There were still, at least up to a certain time in the Roman Empire, and there were also heresies as well Arianism that even reached the imperial echelons, etc., and was always there, also in the form of think about the Germanic warriors that fought in the Roman army. Many of them were still pagan or Arian in great number. So the church at this point was naturally progressively expanding in the state up to the point of essentially transforming eventually at the end of the 4th century the Roman Empire in a Christian empire officially, but it was still this thing that was still in evolution in many ways, and had still to it was very committed in putting to secure the role of the church into the state. So this is kind of the typical. This is when the typical view of the bond between Christianity and an empire actually was created. This is not simply something anecdotal, because you have really to understand what this meant. Christianity was naturally an exclusive religion. The empire was not a empire; it was the universal empire. This is something we often forget. We like to secularize and to kind of rationalize certain things, but you really have to think it from the perspective of these guys. Of course, there were other empires. Of course, the Roman Empire was not a global empire, but for those people it was, because objectively, for them, the whole world was under the Roman Empire. Even the peoples that lived out of the, let's say, across the Rhine or the Danube were formally gravitating, however, around this empire, and how couldn't it be? So there was the empire, and the Christian religion was the, let's say, the totalizing factor in this. I mean, the idea that, however, the empire had to spread Christianity as well in the rest of the world, and a big deal of the imperial ideologies were also relatively concerning war at this time were aimed at that, especially when there were in the presence of all these peoples out there that were still not Christianized, and that were incidentally partly enemy of the empire. So in this liturgy, the main thing was an invocation to God. I mean, talking about the idea of conflict and of what the role of the empire had to be, is that God was invocated in order to protect the temporal rulers, and stressing on this triad that already existed into the pagan times. There was the one of Pax, Securitas, and Libertas. So these were very important terms in many ways. The Pax is even part of the liturgy still today, as the Latin salutation Pax Vobis, is peace to you, right? And the Pax naturally has to do with a broader meaning. It's not just simply the pacification of the empire. It's not just a physical peace of the people dwelling into the empire. It naturally was interpreted in this way as well, as we were saying. Peace was one of the it's what the empire had essentially built on as a concept. I mean, think about Augustus, that brought all these extremely violent times of civil wars that had engulfed the whole republic, and the idea of the Pax Romana is something that obviously the Romans took great pride from. Naturally, at this point, the Pax is it's meant also in the Christian term. So it's a peace that has to permeate the existence by imitating Christ's behavior, essentially. And it's an inner peace. It's the idea that if you stick to Christian principles, you'll have a essentially a peaceful soul. This is very important because there was a parallelism as well between the pacification of the empire and the inner Christian the soul, the state of the soul. This is definitely was so important. The Securitas instead is something else. The Securitas was a Roman goddess, by the way, and the meaning here is safety as essentially a precondition to act confidently. I don't know. This is just one because these Latin words have many different meanings actually, but this is, I believe, the one that more than else depicts it. I mean, if the empire is not safe, then it cannot act in also for the good of the Christian community as well. The same goes a bit with the term libertas, that is that has to do with same word liber, that in the in Latin is the essentially the legally free man. So the contrary of serf, the slave, of servus in Latin. So this is very important because this isn't something that at the time was given for granted, as there were still many slaves. So the idea is you could either be born as a freeman or as a slave at the time, and it made a big deal of a difference. The Christianity pushed towards kind of the elimination of slavery, but it took really a lot, and it mostly was a process that you have to look under many other points of view to explain how it really happened. Let's just say the slaves were out there in the Christian empire as well. Probably less complexity than in previous times, but this has also to do with much of how Roman society had changed in the first place, and not really for the best, because most of the people at the time were very, very poor. So maybe they were freemen legally, but they didn't really live as such anymore. I made a video about I think it was called From the Late Antique Villa to the Early Medieval Cortes. It's in Medieval Society playlist, in which I discuss how essentially the the progressive loss in freedom that characterized especially the lower classes during the Middle Ages was starting in many ways as a social asset, let's say, already in the late antique era. I mean, with the Constantinian reforms, they favored the gold, the richer classes, and then the fact that everyone had essentially to remain tied to his father's job, and so there was a progressive stratification of society, and from which it was very difficult to change status and social status naturally, and crafts and jobs, etc. And at this time there were really very few wealthy people and really a lot of poor people. And this is partly also why Christianity spread so much, because it had been addressed to kind of the poorer strata of society, and this gave them sort of hope, and given their condition, etc. But now we don't get into this because so going back to the liturgy, so you understand what Pax, Securitas, and Libertas are actually discussing. It's really a hybrid. It's the typical of the late antique times. It's this hybrid between the Christian and Roman pagan principles in many ways. So you hear these Latin words that were obviously coming from the Roman culture, that had a fully pagan meaning, that was essentially readapted into Christian fashion. It was a big deal of work in order to achieve this. I mean, from the Christians to manage to integrate these principles and to kind of redefining them in a Christian fashion. It was a pretty successful one in many ways. Pretty successful work. So in this Sacramentarium Leonianum, what you find is that a lot of emphasis is placed especially on the Pax, on the peace. So when you read these texts, you realize that there was some kind of the perception, not really much explicitated, but always kind of looming on, is that of the non-Roman peoples. So these peoples that didn't dwell into the Roman Empire directly, and that incidentally ended up to overlap with the non-Christian peoples. And this is very, very important because we are at the times of the migration era, or the barbarian invasions, if you prefer. So this was a moment of into which also peace was not something you could give for granted. The 4th and 5th centuries were centuries of great wars and devastations, and this was deeply felt by the populations of the empire, and therefore it's very meaningful that the prayers of the liturgy had to take into account the presence of these enemies that are always there, in as a potential threat at best, let's say. And this naturally was kind of easy to stress as long naturally as there was this dichotomy of the empire and the barbarians. So the Roman Empire, especially in the 4th century, was relatively solid. I mean, the Constantinian reforms had solidly strengthened it, contrarily wise to what, and I don't really understand why, lots of people really believe. During the 5th century, things started to really go pretty seriously wrong, especially in the West. That would in fact fall, but we have to take into consideration also the great weakness of the same Roman state at this point. I mean, part of the of peace was definitely threatened by the same plots in the imperial court and civil wars, not just the barbarians. But it was still important, however, that the Roman Empire was Christian, and there were lots of people out there that weren't. So it was easy to stress, okay, those are the barbarians, and those are, as non-Christians, they're evidently something negative in some way. They're not necessarily destroyers, but they're still kind of enemies of the faith in some measure. But this is still relatively contained in this liturgy. So, passing from the Sacramentarium Leonianum to the Gelasian one. So the so later in times, naturally, going on. And we remain, by the way, this is important to remember, we are still talking, and we'll keep talking now for a while, just about a sacramentaries that were created actually into Rome proper. Because these came from, they take the name from the popes, you understand, that the Leonianum from Leo the Great, Gelasius, etc., from Pope Gelasius I at the end of the 5th century. So they're kind of these figures that refer to Italy and to Rome more specifically. And by the way, this gives you the dimension also of how important was already the church into Rome and Italy at that time. And it's very meaningful because the 4th and 5th centuries were this moment in which the West was kind of weakening sensibly from a political point of view. So this is a moment in which the church really begins to take a lot of to have a lot to do, to achieve, to almost substitute the empire, and literally also into strictly administrative matters. So other regions of Europe didn't really produce these liturgies because they had less. The church was relatively less important in there, despite, especially in the West, it was definitely rising pretty much. And Rome already had in the West this kind of important role. The main difference in this changed with the Gregorian reforms into the 11th century, but I'd say the primacy of Rome was something, it was a primacy of charity that was recognized to Rome, and a big deal of the Western churches, despite being relatively autonomous from Rome, really owed the Roman Papal a lot in terms of moral prestige, and there was a lot of ideological production at this point from Rome that also partly made this sacramentaries produced and surviving over time. So the still talking about the Gelasian sacramentary that remains in Rome always, but things start to change a little bit, because there are certain contents that start differentiating in pretty contrasting way from the so-called orationes tempore belli that were mutated from the Leonine tradition. Orationes tempore belli means the orations of wartime. So in these that were present in the Leonian sacramentary, there is always this central concept of peace, to which the allusions to the enemy remain relatively vague, and that were inherited. These orationes were inherited by the Gelasian sacramentary, and next to these there were, however, new contents into which the Gelasian tradition basically starts to delineate the figure of these enemies that are now explicitly the same enemies of the empire. So while in previous times was, if you want, a more philosophical approach to the idea of the enemy through the Latin term hostis, that is really unambiguous terms, because hostis means the enemy, and in the early Christian times, this term could define essentially either a spiritual or a theological, disciplinary, or even political and military enemy at time. So naturally the spiritual enemy is the devil, it's sin. Then there are the heretics as well, and therefore not just the hostis is not just the military enemy, the political and military enemy. It can be all. In the Gelasian tradition, instead, the whole thing goes towards this last option. That is, the political and military enemy is essentially the main threat at this point. So what we see essentially is war starting to break out, to invade dramatically into Christian liturgy. And this is very important because there are many invocations of peace now. So that there is really a sense that war was all around. And we're not just talking about the orationes tempore belli, but also the misse tempore belli, and especially the missa pro regibus. So there are 4 misse tempore belli, that is essentially the masses for wartime, and also the mass for the kings. This is very important because it tells you that there's a more direct involvement into war, and also an open demand to God to help into this. And in these texts, the prayer doesn't really limit itself to ask for peace, and it asks actually that God's strength, that God could help obtaining victory against the savagery, the ferocity, let's say, of the barbarian populations. This prayer asks in Latin on the victory over the feritas barbarorum gentium. Now this is very important in Latin because it really means the ferocity of the barbarian peoples. And it also asks ostium fortitudo te pro nobis pugnante frangator, which means essentially referring to God, that he is that he may fight. I mean, he asks God to fight together alongside with the community of the faithful, so that the strengths of the enemies could be destroyed. This is really important because it stresses, especially this last word, stresses the fortitudo. Fortitudo in Latin is not really just physical strength. It's really like also the resilience, also this kind of actual very physical ability of keeping fighting in a certain way, so these enemies are not considered as sort of a that there is not a counterpart in here. I mean, the counterpart is essentially God at this point, right? It's not just like in the previous tradition to ask essentially a good outcome for the expeditions of war that were led by, say, the emperor. At this point, we see something different. We see that it's as if the Christian community was left alone, fighting against this threat, and that is a very strong threat. It's something that has a physical connotation, so that God has to fight alongside us in order to prevent the enemies to succeed. So these are not symbolical wars. These are real wars. They don't leave anything left to imagination. And another very important consequence of this is that the enemies of the church at this point are, and the ones of civil society, are substantially perceived as overlapping. So that it's really a war that starts getting more definite, also religious connotations. Also in here there is a lot of military symbolism, and also a reference to let's say it in another way, that there are certain, in Christian literature, and from the origins, it's pretty common, the reference to military symbology, and the reference to wars against spiritual enemies. And therefore, what is very meaningful in the Gelasian sacramentary is instead the presence of real enemies. So people in flesh and bones that that in this sense start acquiring even certain negative characters that go beyond the merely as we saw, first of all, before we saw the fortitudo of the enemy. The fortitudo is something you have also if you are strong, if you're fit, etc. So what the sacramentarists did was to demonize in part these enemies, definitely as non-Christians. So something that associated the physical and the spiritual negative, negative characters. Yes, these guys were strong, etc., but they didn't believe in the Christian religion. So even I'm stressing this because in the future, in the tradition that would have existed into the Middle Ages, the idea of stressing the ferocity, also the physical strength, and it's something that was increasingly that always remained there. I mean, rarely into the Middle Ages you find an enemy from the sources that is weak. Everybody wants to. I mean, it can be weak and weaked from a moral point of view, but usually they're strong. The enemies are strong physically. They have this kind of hurtly, very hurtly strength in many ways. They're fit, they're young, they're strong, etc. But in this sense, they also lack. They concentrate too much on that, and they forget the spiritual part. So this happened also naturally when there were enemies that were Christians as well. At this moment, instead, excuse me, I drink once again. what was done mainly was demonizing these enemies um, as enemies of Christianity to core. So the demonization of the enemy is also a way to criticize him morally, to blame him, to assigning guilt to it, and this is actually done in every single culture. And the even if in especially from the modern age, this kind of became a sort of ritual, um, um, or at least it evolved into active propaganda. It was kind of standard in many ways, but at this time this was not banal. It was not something that was perceived as a regular thing to do. It really starts appearing because these enemies start appearing physically into the Christian society, and therefore they are automatically blamed as the destructors of that Christian society as well. So passing from the Gelasian sacramentary, we go to the so-called Sacramentarium Gregorianum. So this is instead the sacramentary of Pope Gregory the Great, where essentially during the 7th century. Gregory the Great was renownedly one of the most important figures in history. He lived between the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. I mean, he was Pope between the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. And also this sacramentary contains Orationes Tempore Belli and the Misse Tempore Belli. And so in part these inherit the much from the previous sacramentaries. So and you see that also in here the enemies of the Roman Empire are the same are equivalent to the enemies of the Christians. So there is in this moment there is establishes a very strong bond between the victorious peace of the people of God and the increase of faith in here. So these three sacramentaries, the Leonine, the Gelasian and the Gregorian ones, are really essentially tracing a history of the Italian perspective between the 4th and the 7th century. So in here they're interesting in chronological order because they show essentially the passage from Italy to still being one of the most important areas of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, passing essentially outside of it, or partly at least, in the 7th century, when Italy was split essentially between the Longobards and the Byzantines. And in this sense it's not surprising to see this transformation, the idea of the passage between, from a fully Christian Roman Empire and this threat, a looming threat of the barbarians that are associated to the enemies of the Christian society, and that are kind of also entering here. Naturally, it's a very subjective perspective in many ways, because this is the perspective of the Roman Pope that had politically and militarily very definite strategical objectives, and that naturally tended to use its spiritual weapons to demonize also part of the enemies that were in here. In the 7th century we are with the Longobards now. I've been discussing a lot about Longobards, and And today, everybody who studies Longobard history on up-to-date bibliography perfectly knows that Longobards weren't the barbaric destructors that, in fact, the same Papal historiography has tried to depict. On the contrary, but it's still important to understand why this was done. Naturally, the Longobards at this time were still Arian, by the way. The idea there is a lot of bad things that were written from in Rome against the Longobards previously, incidentally, to the beginning of the 7th century, because it's from the 7th century that really the Pope begins actually. First of all, the Longobards begin to convert to Catholicism, and without any violence, any problem whatsoever. But at this time, they naturally were they were fighting against the Byzantines, and the Pope was pro-Byzantine, in part because also the Pope at this time was trying essentially to carve his own power into Italy, and the Byzantine Empire was starting getting engulfed with the Arab invasions. So we're slightly like the generation before in here. So, however, the Byzantines were harshly fighting also among each other and against the Persians at this point. So Italy was a bit left alone, and it was important for the Pope, however, to stress the fact that these Longobards were a possible threat, however, also for the Roman and therefore for the whole Christian society. So we can guess that these enemies of the Romans and of the Christians were interpreted like this, not only just because of the threat of the posed by the Longobards as as this theoretically hostile, bordering entity, but also because they were still Catholic at this time, and eventually things changed. So this is pretty. We are right in time, let's say, not to see that happening. However, yet the most important thing is that such concept that the enemy of the Christians are essentially political and military enemies, so real enemies, and that war in this sense could absorb so much from the society to even influence so deeply the fabric of the Christian liturgy is very, very meaningful. And this was not happening just in Italy, it was happening also elsewhere. Italy had really kind of suffered probably the worst of this, and not just from here we stress the Longobards, but think even about the Greek-Gothic War, the problem of the Goths who were Arians, and all the destructions that ensued because of that, and the papal the papal propaganda had double standards, as for previously before the Greek-Gothic War, the Goths were kind of praised, in part in spite they were Arians, because they were kind of respectful towards the Pope and the Roman Senate, while at the same time the Vandals were criticized and represented as monsters simply because mostly they were Arians. It's not that the Vandals really did a lot of devastations themselves. Surely, yeah, they launched offensives, etc. They even sacked Rome, but they weren't actually doing these unconsiderate destructions that made them worse than others. So it's really here we have to understand every perspective in here. Actually, I understand pretty much also the Roman perspective in here, the papal perspective saying better, because even Vandals, yeah, they weren't really gentle souls like anyone at the time, but they were. The point is that they were objectively in contrast up to a certain point to the to what the say the Roman strategy was at that point. Even the Ostrogoths, after all were pretty good rulers into Italy, and they kind of also went against the Vandals. They managed to recover Sicily to do so. These double standards are also kind of explainable. And now I don't want to say anything wrong against what the popes were doing at this time, because actually waging war for no apparent reason, but needs of expansion, bare political and military needs is something that is it's kind of negative, especially from a Christian point of view. It's something you should try to avoid. So also in here, reading the world perspective of the papacy is interesting. However, I promise I will kind of make another video in the future to prove I don't have anti-papal prejudices, because I really don't. I admit I'm a Longobard fan, so I sometimes I like to stress this thing that the papacy was kind of using pretty much its spiritual weapons as well to its ideological weapons to demonize, in fact, the enemies, and this is true as well. But you have to understand papal perspective as well, in part, and I will surely say something about that in the future more thoroughly. So, and as we've seen, Italy produced these very important sacramentary, from which we know so much. But there is not just Italy, and if we go look at the rest of Europe, this time of Western Europe, so this Latin Germanic world broadly meant, we start seeing that here the liturgical customs naturally are different from the Italian ones. So also in these other areas we can spot from the local liturgy this actually quite pressing fear of war and of the enemies. So that was pretty widespread as well. And therefore the demand for a military victory perceived as sort of a sort of a prerequisite requirement for the triumph of faith. However, what is really important in here, very important, is that next to demonization of the enemy, there is something more. That is the sanctification of the Christian warrior. That starts emerging. So this was a kind of a natural consequence, in part. This is something you don't find in the papal sacramentaries. Why is this? Well, it's pretty complicated, and I mean it's not really extremely complicated. It's complex, more than complicated, and however, maybe talking about the differences with other areas is kind of more meaningful. But I can maybe give a general answer now. The idea is that the papacy is theoretically a fully spiritual power, even if it is not, because the papacy now is extremely powerful. There are still Byzantine garrisons in Rome that, formally figure as foreign troops at this point, even for Italian standards. But it's really, Rome is still a very big city, and it is very powerful. There are lots of people who go living in there. The papacy has a lot of land, manages the city, organizes it, administrates it. I mean, the papacy is not just a merely spiritual power. However, it has to stress its holiness. So it cannot stress the idea that there is a something sacred into war. And this is actually probably nothing to do with, not much at least, to do with Rome in itself in this, but it really has to do with more the Eastern influence, because in the Byzantine Empire, the concept of to make a holy war is not actually there. The Byzantines remained theoretically, because the practice was completely different. Even if you look at the Byzantine Empire of the 7th century, you realize that the military heads of the soldiers was still completely pagan at this point. They were a Christian army with Christian insignia, but their military virtues among the soldiery were the same that existed in pre-Christian times still. They were very earthly, very material, if you want, as well. But from a strictly theoretical point of view, the Byzantine Empire was pretty serious about the scriptures, and so naturally war and bloodshed as a great sin. So this existed also in the West, but in the West it was a different society. In the East, the Byzantines now, especially when the Arabs arrived, and they also have this kind of sacralization of warfare naturally that always existed as a general intent, because that was the Roman Empire, so it was the Christian Empire, and fighting against the enemies of the empire equated to fight against the enemies of the faith. So because that was the empire of God in the first place. But warriors could not be sacralized in the Byzantine East. Doesn't matter how much military saints were important from this point of view and how theory differed from practice. Sacralization of war is something of the Christian warrior proper. It was not something that could be done in the East, because it equated to exalt bloodshed in some measure. Or I know, this was not really done even in the West, so don't get me wrong. Now we will try to get more in detail from that. But simply in the East there was still a state with an army ruled by an emperor. In the West it was essentially a bunch of we can't say tribes because there were kingdoms as well, but it was still a very clanic view of war. And to which a lot of emphasis was placed on the individual soldier, and the individual warrior, not soldier, because these were warriors, not really soldiers. And therefore this ethos could not be erased. These guys, think of all these populations like the Franks, the Longobards, the Goths, etc. They could be Christianized, but their military ethos was still the warrior one. So there was also a need that came, especially during the evangelization of these peoples, and it went on. This happened also for the Saxons, etc. There was a great cultural process of, kind of integration of these military models in part. The Saxons, when they were conquered by Charlemagne, were made believe essentially that Jesus and his disciples were like a chieftain with his comitatus. They like to exalt the fact of when St. Peter cuts an ear to a Roman soldier as this, emphasizing the blood, the thing, and to stress, let's say, the Christian bonds, trying to adapt them in part to what the warlike Saxon mentality was. So the West, in order to function, had to undergo this relative transformation, also partly of the Christian ethos. And the result, so this is why it's difficult to explain it, because it took a lot of time before this progressed. The Western and Eastern Christianity at this point were the same at the beginning. If you arrive at the 11th century, you find there is a schism, and you find something radically different as the Westerners launch crusades. They are launched, by the way, by the Pope, so by a bishop, and you find in the East you find something that could not even minimally conceive anything like that. So this is a process that really took centuries before, but you understand how different in this sense. The paths of the same Christianity were between East and West during this time. So Rome, so going back to the question, was a place that for many centuries still was extremely influenced by the Byzantine mentality. Like Rome up to the 12th century was more projected actually towards the east, Constantinople, the Mediterranean, than the Romano-Germanic north. You can see that. I mean, if you go to Rome, you see all this beautiful, even Byzantine art was present, because those were the models the Romans were sticking to. And even when Rome was part of the Holy Roman Empire, in this sense was its southernmost area, frontier, by the way, with a southern Italian environment, was largely at least influenced by the Byzantines. And this is important to explain why the Roman sacramentary do not really really stress the sacralization of the warrior, as this would have happened instead elsewhere, especially in, let's say now, in France. We could make other examples of this, telling the truth, like the Mozarabic liturgy. So, the Mozarabic rite is essentially also the Visigothic or Hispanic or Toledan or Isidorian, as you want to call them, one. So it was a liturgy that was born into the Iberian Church in the 4th century. So it was also in here. It's very important to stress how every region of Europe at this time had a kind of its own liturgy. It's not. It's something that went on for a long time. I mean, the Mozarabic rite is something that survived even the Islamic domination up to the 11th century, when essentially it's the Church of Rome that decides to take it out and to export its own into Spain. But every region had kind of its own differences, because there was not a central head of the church. Rome was not that. Until the Gregorian reforms, this was not true. I mean, if for instance, if the Iberian Peninsula had not been conquered by the Muslims, it's possible that, I don't know, we would have had Toledo as one of the most important centers of Christianity in parallel with Rome. And given how the medieval things evolved, even from a political and territorial point of view, I don't know, we might have had more than one church in the West, even naturally previously to the Reform. I mean, this was not something given for granted in the past, in early medieval times. And every local church kind of developed something different. This is why ecclesiastical sources of that period are so meaningful from this point of view, because they really tell you they do not depend from a center. They are all centers by themselves. They make up centers all by themselves, and according to what the local political interests were, they created different visions of the world. Think about also the ecumenical councils. So you think that the main ecumenical councils, especially in the late antique and early medieval times, were something that stated something precise and that everybody stuck to? Absolutely not. Every bishop that went to those councils, in, I don't know, in Constantinople, in, I don't know, somewhere, wherever they were held, that they came back home and they kind of had their own accounts of how the council had gone, and they could modify them. So there is actually a huge field of research in this, because we realized that that every kind of modification was done on these texts really equated to a reason that is very important to, because it was dictated by the local political convenience, by the local society, by the local interests, and that tells us so much of what was going on, and that, by the way, reveals us in a moment in which there are otherwise very scanty sources, however, the dynamism of early medieval Europe that is being completely forgotten, and that instead was very, very active. So, in the case of the Mozart liturgy, as I was saying, maybe we'll skip this because, by the way, I don't really know much about it, but it's kind of easy to stress that in the Mozart liturgy, the sacralization of the Christian warrior is more evident, because really what happened in Spain is naturally the local church was invaded by the Islamic rulers, and the Visigothic liturgy kept living on under Muslim domination, but naturally those who escaped in the north, where in the mountains where the Muslims basically practically never arrived to rule, at least directly, were stressing obviously this kind of survivors perspective, that is, we have survived because our duty is to eventually come back again, and we are kind of the chosen people to go, and that have necessarily to fight against the heathens that have invaded Spain, and that have, in this sense, a holy mission. And this is very important because also during the Reconquista, the Spanish, the Iberian kingdoms had really a huge ideological and a very specific ideological mindset relatively to the Holy War and their religious mission. But this was such an exceptional case that it's not really useful to what we want to see today, because in this sense the Iberian Peninsula was pretty much isolated in this, and it really developed this mindset and liturgy because of this macroscopic evidence of the Islamic invasion. What is more interesting is to see how, for instance, the Italian liturgy differed from the French one. This is much more interesting, because there are many ways, by the way, certain also halfways between this, because for instance, we will see it, the Roman liturgy was very different from the Milanese liturgy. It was more similar to the French one. It's really the Frankish liturgy that is perhaps very much more meaningful, because it dwelt kind of in a different kind on its own. Also in here, the so-called Gallican liturgy, Gallican obviously takes name from Gaul, and it refers to essentially what is the French perspective of the thing. Especially French at this point means Frankish, because we're talking about the northern French, northern Gaul, Frankish kingdoms, essentially. I say kingdoms because at this point, it was theoretically the Frankish kingdom, but they were split, by the way, de facto, but this is not important, maybe. What is important is that also in here, Gaul had lots of a very different tradition from the Roman one since an early age. We have been talking on Schwerpunkt really a lot about late antique and early medieval Gaul, how really Gaul had kind of surpassed also Italy as a whole in its also cultural production. How, let's say, Gallic society in many ways didn't suffer the fracture that existed in Italy from the late antique to the early medieval world, and especially Gaul harbored this huge domination of the Franks that managed to produce, from a monarchical point of view, a sort of very independent thought, or at least a very autonomous thought compared to the one of the Roman Church, from the one of the Roman Church, sorry. So, as we were saying before, this was happening a bit everywhere, and also Milan, so with the Ambrosian liturgy, for instance, was a kind of halfway between the Roman and the Frankish liturgy. What's the main difference between the Gallic liturgy and the Roman one? Well, essentially, the Franks at this point didn't have that pressing, and especially, let's say better, the Frankish Church, or the Gallo-Frankish Church, as you want to call it. Because here it really depends. We can't really make it a matter, because secular powers were reasoning in one way and the Church was reasoning in another. So when we say the Frankish Church, we're not saying necessarily the Merovingian dynasty. We are still talking about two different things that, however, mutually supported each other. And the Gallic Church didn't really had all that worries that the Roman one had. The Gallic Church at this point was not threatened by enemies substantially. Unlike Rome, that had to deal with the Longobards and was even besieged, and the surroundings ravaged, etc. So that had been a pretty serious business that entailed naturally stressing, especially the alliance with Constantinople, and for military aid, and in this sense sticking to the orthodoxy. This is, by the way, I mean, rather than the orthodoxy, let's say the closeness to Constantinople, because telling the truth, the Roman Church was pretty much in line with the Longobard one, for instance, much more than it was with the one of Constantinople most of the times. As Constantinople at this time was kind of venturing strange heterodox thinking that was aimed at kind of appeasing the heretical communities that existed into the east, not to lose power on them. And the Roman Church was pretty much more orthodox than the Eastern one at this point in the early medieval times. And the Longobards actually, in spite of being Arians for a long time, a relatively long time actually, we said at the beginning of the 7th century they began to, by the mid of the 7th century they basically got almost fully Catholic, and by the end of the century they were fully Catholic. But the Longobards kind of stuck to Rome. Also, this is important. So even this worry that is showed by the Roman Church is sometimes a bit theoretical and ideological, and has to be read also in here as a Roman liturgy, that it was something that really reached pretty far. It was nothing of a relatively smaller scale like the one of other churches around Western Europe. It was something that looked a bit at the higher, the higher echelons. So it was also something a bit more aristocratic in many ways. But if you look at the practice, you realize that also in here there was not much of a let's say, of a religious threat from the Longobards, for instance. And that really Rome played the game, siding in alternate ways, either with the Longobards or with the Empire. The Gallic Church was wholly different at this point. It didn't have this problem. There was a unique Frankish kingdom, or at least even if it was split in two parts, because at every generation the Franks split their domains and wars ensued as well, there was still a broader, that nobody was threatening the Franks from the outside at this point. And so we're talking still about the early times. The Arabs are not still here. We're talking in pre-Carolingian times, fully Merovingian period, where, by the way, the relations, the essentials in the relations between the Merovingian dynasty and the Gallic Church were established in the political and institutional frame that we know. And the Gallo-Frankish clergy at this time was shielded, it was safe by the Merovingian kingdom. So it could deal with its pastoral business in relative peace. And so war was not really something that touched them directly, more than much. If not these local clashes between the same Frankish nobility, but there was no major threat at the gates, no major invasion, etc. And what is important in here instead to considerate from the Merovingian liturgy is that the Frankish monarchy was, let's say, no, I don't know why I said Merovingian liturgy, but let's say that the Merovingian monarchy was carrying out a very important political and religious agenda. And that was really stressing, in part, however, still the military side of it. It was a sort of religious and military project, centered especially on the figure of Saint Martin of Tours. And so what were they saying really? Well, the Franks were Germans, let's be honest about this. They had a very strong military ethos, and they had conquered Gaul. They had won it through the arms, but they had converted. I made a video about Clovis recently, so you can go check that out. It's in the Medieval France playlist. You can find it easily from, it's called, I don't remember, it's like Clovis, something about Clovis and from Germany to empire, etc. So actually the Franks were a pretty warlike people, but they converted immediately, and they allied immediately with the local clergy. This was very important because the Franks didn't have any other mean to control Gaul, and Clovis was smart enough compared to other Germanic leaders to convert directly to Catholicism instead, passing through Arianism that caused lots of attrition elsewhere among the Goths, the Burgundians, etc. And the religious elites of Gaul had been immediately engaged in the construction of the Merovingian empire, Merovingian kingdom at least. So the sacrality of the Merovingian monarchy was something that existed since the very beginning in many ways, and it was concerted a bit also with these military characters, because indeed this is also something that Gregory of Tours actually writes in his Historia Francorum. I mean, the general meaning was that Clovis had not just was the perfect leader, and because he had won the enemies through the help of God. This is important. The Merovingian kingdom was created because, basically, according to the legend, Clovis had called a bit like Constantine. So here you realize the traditions, how they flowed. The Christian God, in a moment during the battle against the Alemanni, to which the Franks were about to lose, and he kind of made a perfect pagan contract. He said to the Christian god, if you let me win, I will convert. And so it happens naturally that God gives victory to the Franks, and Clovis converts. And he converts the whole Frankish people because he's a military leader. He doesn't convert the people because the people gets enlightened by God. It's because Clovis got enlightened by God, and as a Germanic chieftain, all his retinue, all the Frankish warriors fighting alongside with him, convert by imitation. This is also very important because this was not normal. Normally, the Germanic leaders were just appointed for the sake of war, and then nobody cared about what they had to say in the political. To rule the society. So also in here, the strengths of Clovis as an individual leader are magnified, because basically these Frankish warriors are perfectly pagan. Yeah, they converted straight away from one day to another to Catholicism, according to the story. So, and Clovis was extremely pious with the local clergy and etc. So this was the whole thing, and the whole point was also stressing the strictly Gallican tradition of this, the idea that Gaul was somehow a unique thing already by that time, especially in the northern part. This huge Atlantic plains of France that stretch from the Pyrenees to actually beyond France, because the Franks at this point were controlling up to northwestern Germany. But let's say, leaving aside the south, let's say the Burgundian and Visigothic south, that were also geographically more detached and were more gravitating around the Mediterranean than this kind of North European plain. So even the cult of Saint Martin of Tours was something we can say national in many ways. Gaul was a bit embodied, religiously speaking, by the figure of Saint Martin of Tours. And part of the, let's say, this is something that the French monarchy kind of always maintained, historically speaking, is that they felt to be kind of protectors of the church. In the following times, basically, the French kings become vassals of the church, of the Church of Saint-Denis. That is the symbol of France, where all the French kings were buried, and this all dated back to this tradition of Clovis. So from here, the idea that the Frankish monarchy represented the armed arm, in fact, of not of the church, but that they had to protect the church as something, and the Christian society was being developed in there. Also because the Franks, as we've said many times on Schwerpunkt, were actually believing, even before Charlemagne, and ever since Clovis, actually, I discussed this frequently lately, were about, they already had pretty clear in mind, different from other barbarian, say Romano-barbarian kingdoms, that they wanted to recreate a sort of Western Empire. I mean that the Franks wanted to take over everything in the West, and eventually they managed to do that. And they immediately, and they inherited actually a lot of the strictly Roman imperial, and I stress imperial, model. These Germans were thinking essentially that God, so this is important why I always stress words like Romano-Germanic, because we have to stress the hybrid here, that God had entrusted them the rule of such a huge area of Gaul, and that therefore this equated to kind of military glory. This naturally was a Christian God, but this idea that power is conferred by the divinity is something that was part of the same pagan background. The whole Arian civilization revolves around this. I mean, the idea that empire, the imperium proper, is something that stems from the divine, from the divine, and that is given by God to the leaders that are gifted with this only if they are worthy of it and they behave perfectly. So this is a very great, a very developed, not just a great theology, but something greater behind this. These Franks, yeah, they were Christians now, but by name, they still were permeated with all these kind of obsessions of conquest and of greatness. It's like any other people, by the way, that had also very strictly military connotation. So, as a consequence, the Franks were already having in their mind the idea that the warrior spirituality was there. They never got over it. They kind of made it pass relatively unchanged from paganism to Christianity. So while in Rome the popes were people that were still drawn from the senatorial entourage, think about Gregory VII, but even the previous one, not Gregory II, excuse me, Gregory the Great, Gregory VII, we named it before during Gregorian reform, that's stuck in my mind. Gregory the Great, they were all kind of Roman, and I would stress senatorial in mind. So they were sticking to those models that were essentially statal, like the one of Constantinople, where the church was subjected to the emperor, and the well, now I don't know why I say this, because this is not the point I wanted to make, but in a certain sense we're sticking to a sort of a very much more orthodox thinking, to which you couldn't really stress the sacralization of a warrior, because it sounded something pretty wrong given what warriors do, that is to sin because they kill, and in Rome that tradition, that orthodox belief was pretty much alive. Well, in the Frankish world that wasn't very clear. They were Christians, but their knowledge of Christianity was pretty blurred. This is self-evident. Just look at what Christianity in Central Northern Europe was at this time. In certain cases almost non-existent, but even the clergy they didn't even know how to read Latin, let's be honest about this, and this is something that now we're talking about relatively ancient times, like the 6th and 7th century, but this was true up still at Charlemagne's time, where in fact the Carolingians trying to reform the church because they realized that it really sucked. People couldn't even understand what they were reading, and they were distorting the phrases, the words in Latin. It was just a rite, let's be honest about this. So at the time of Gregory I, he said Rome was still pretty much sort of appendix of the Roman Empire, and they stuck to a completely different model that was the one of the cultural elitism in part as well, of the northern France. Think about literacy in northern France compared to central and southern Italy this time. Yeah, I mean, it was two, I can't say antithetic worlds because they still had much in common, but I mean, okay, it was simply something very, very, very different. So so this kind of works for the Merovingians. What happens with the Carolingians actually? Because this is also very interesting, and I will also dedicate a lot of space to this in the future. The Carolingians changed these views even more. as we just said now, the Carolingians reformed the church. And the reformation of the Carolingian church is something extremely thorny to discuss, because I mean, it's pretty obvious that since especially Pippin the Short, the Franks began to deal pretty. I mean, the Frankish sovereigns began to deal pretty in depth with liturgy, and kind of stressing political and even national values. But it's difficult to explain it to which extent. Let's just say for now that just like something that was in common between the Merovingians and the Carolingians, as the latter inherited from the first, was the idea that there was a kind of, we can't say national in very anachronistic terms, about the Gallic Church and the Gallic and the Frankish Empire as such. I mean, it was all one with the local church as a sort of independent thing, even from Rome, as it was normal at the time. And the Carolingians, however, at this point were creating an empire, or better, recreating an empire and expanding it and strengthening it. So doing something that objectively in the West had never been seen since Roman times, and although on very different premises. So at this point, the Carolingians, for all the reasons of the relation with the papacy, they start taking a lot of Roman liturgy as well. There is a very powerful injection, especially after they conquered Longobard Italy, and they kind of strengthened their bond with the papacy. It was actually very ancient, but it's only at this time that kind of kicks in and gives birth to something different that will evolve into the Holy Roman Empire. They start injecting a huge amount of Roman models into the Frankish Empire. So, for instance, there is a lot of let's say there is a sort of fusion also between the Roman and Gallic liturgy. For instance, the Benedictiones Tempore Belli, so the benedictions of the war times, and the Misse Tempore Belli, so the famous masses of wartime, become more frequent, and especially clearer texts. Why is this? Well, naturally there was a big deal of propaganda attached to that, because therefore political value, because the Carolingians were all about war. Let's be honest about this. Their empire was built like that. There was a very few public tradition into the Frankish world, if none at all. The Merovingians had created the empire not as in fact, not something public, but as something private. Everything pertained to the dynasty. Yeah, there were freemen living in there, but the Frankish kingdom was a Merovingian thing, and that is what actually all the rest of the nobility thought like. That they had a very spontaneous, that there had been a lot of fragmentation, naturally, of the Merovingian Empire, and that's from which eventually the Carolingians emerged. So all these local aristocracies thought of the empire as something private, and that's how the Carolingians, inspired some more enlightened figures like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, realized that something more public and centralized had to be formed, but that completely failed, because there was evidently no fabric in the Frankish world onto which to build such a thing. And war was a gluing factor. Huh? You see that as long as the Carolingians expanded the empire held together. When they stopped and they had to consolidate, they collapsed. So war was very important in the Frankish world. The Franks were famous at this point because they created the first, something unseen at the time in the Romano-Germanic world. That was a professional army, from which, through the beneficium, that's the only thing that eventually would give birth to the so-called feudalism. So the idea, I pay you in advance by giving you land so that you can provide, you can provide enough troops to send me to fight. And actually, in the Carolingian world, it was mostly mounted cavalry, and that's how, in fact, the heavy feudal cavalry was actually born progressively, naturally, but it started from here and what the Franks did at this point. So the Franks carried out expeditions literally every single year, and the novelty in the Frankish annals was writing something like, this year there was no expedition, which meant that all the other years there was one, and it was normal. It was strange that there wasn't an expedition one year. So you understand that, especially with the needs, the Carolingians had to reinforce also the fitness of the imperial clergy. A huge emphasis was attached to also the religious meaning of the Frankish expeditions as well. Also because the Franks fought with a freaking lot of pagan peoples. Take the Saxons, takes the Arabs, take the Avars, take the Slavs, etc. So these enemies were perceived not just as normal political military enemies, but also as heathens, and therefore enemies of Christianity. The most ancient example of this is contained into Gelasian's sacramentary, into which there is a mass which is specifically dedicated to the armies that are about to leave for war, to be sent to war. So the title of this is called, if you want to look at that, it's in Latin, Missa in perfectionem ostium eontium in proedium. So this stresses quite explicitly, that this is the mass that has to be performed at the leave of those who have to go to war against the enemies in war. They have to go to battle against the enemies. So what appears that has always fascinated me in this Carolingian, from this Carolingian religious conceptions, is the extreme frequency of references to the Old Testament. This is very important because, as it's renowned, the Old Testament has a lot about war. If you really want to read a beautiful military history source, read the Bible, because it's plenty of that. And all these references to the Old Testament in the Carolingian Empire definitely makes us realize how more fitting to the new necessities this military liturgy was. The idea that the the value of war as a holy enterprise and something sacred in many ways was stressed by the Carolingians. And this was part of the whole political and religious Carolingian propaganda, really. So this wasn't anymore about tributing to God the essential merit for victory, but it also invoked God. This liturgy also invoked God as military commander, participating to the battle. So basically calling God to commit and to engage him into the combat as well, into the, or at least in the events of his people, like with the Jews in the Old Testament. This is it. I mean, in the Old Testament, God definitely participates in the side of the Jewish kings into the military matters. He's really mindful about that. He's very there is always almost even a colloquial relation between the Jewish kings and slash commanders and God, even for the battle plans and so this in the Frankish mindset was still very superficially Christianized and had in this sense still to choose, was still open to options. The Old Testament was really much more fitting to the Frankish mindset than the new one. It was much more exoteric in many ways. It was also more difficult to understand. The Old Testament was perfect for a Frankish warrior, for a Frankish leader. It's all about war. This is what the Franks did every day, so they felt at home but reading the Old Testament. So there was naturally a huge reference also in the wake of this Carolingian tradition into the medieval world of the exodus of Israel from Egypt, into which even war is seen as the profectio in Latin, for instance, is considered as a sort of mystical journey, at the end of which there's a promised land to be taken. This is very important because what were these Franks doing? These Franks were essentially mounting up huge expeditions that had to cross sometimes even thousands of kilometers at that time across Europe, back and forth. So even think about not just war in combat and the climatic battles and stuff, but just think of what it takes in the 9th century to move, I don't know, from Tours, let's put it, if you are a Frankish count or a bishop that has to mount an expedition to go fight on the Elbe River. Think about the time that let's leave aside the resources for now. Let's try to stick to the individual point of view. Think about the journey. Pretty. First of all, it was a risky business in the first place, because when you left home, you already knew you might have not come back, given how life was at that time. But even taking these huge journeys, crossing lots of places, these people were reading, or at least they were read, probably most of the times as Franks, the history of the Jews that were fleeing from Egypt to go through perils and through the desert and through to ultimately reach the promised land. The promised land of the Franks was the one they conquered from other peoples, and in the name of God. So this mystical journey of the march through It was deeply felt by guys who every single year had to go for thousands of kilometers back and forth to ultimately reach a place and to fight for it and to conquer it and to repress rebellions and therefore to attain something greater than the sheer military thing. These Frankish warriors were definitely believing that God would have rewarded them fighting, especially against the pagans, for this greater good of the Christian society. Another, let's say, episode of the Old Testament, by the way, was very, very much appreciated by Charlemagne, was the one of David and Goliath. Mm. Charlemagne was totally in love with David. You find it, in symbolism, to stress the from one side the something a bit strange also in here, that is the weakness of the Frankish forces, as David was this young boy who was facing the giant Goliath. So this was actually the other way around, because the Frankish forces at this time were definitely the Goliath of the situation, or at least not so much, probably because perhaps, who knows, perhaps the fact that it would be interesting to analyze it from a strictly military point of view, because maybe at this time the Franks were developing their heavy cavalry, and heavy cavalry was extremely expensive, so there was a relatively few of them. I mean, Frankish cavalry could be moved in en masse with pretty consistent numbers, but still the major numbers of the army would be made up by the levy, especially in the full Carolingian times. So the time of Charlemagne was a sort of a need now, especially when consolidating the empire, to recur once again to the local levies, to have a sort of decentralized military control. Whereas at the time of Charles' father, Pippin, and the other ancestors, it had almost mostly been about cavalry, and that's it, because they were moving into a essentially Frankish world already. So once they had settled the business there, they could leave it also relatively unguarded. The armies were not so huge. The same empire was so now it was also relatively smaller, and then in following times. So it might be, however, that the Carolingians were stressing the contained numbers of their elite cavalry to say, oh, look at how many enemies were capable of knocking out just with one knight, that at this time was the strongest warrior you could find in the battlefield. So maybe that's the reason, like Goliath was symbolized, the great numbers of the enemies, but probably this is more metaphorical, and it really has its roots in also Charlemagne's naive but also genuine belief. And so the bigger meaning is that the Carolingians, just like David, were essentially entrusting their fate in God, and they drew force by the awareness of representing the new Israel. This is also important. The idea that, by the way, the metaphor of David and Goliath could work also in terms of that it was the Franks that were alone against the rest of Europe, so defeating enemies that seemed so much more than them, or that were, intimidating by tradition. Think about when the Carolingians managed to crush the Avar Khaganate in the Pannonian Plains. Well, that wasn't so powerful anymore. In fact, it was crushed pretty easily, but the idea of attacking these mighty enemies who were pagan, by the way, as well. Well, in faraway lands, and was conceived as a not a desperate enterprise, but something prodigious in many ways. Especially if you take the Avar expedition of Charlemagne, you realize that the Carolingians had a hugely advanced logistics. There was a masterpiece of the supplies traveling by land, by river, on the Danube. I mean, it was something extremely well coordinated. Charlemagne was not a military genius, but he was a huge logist, a huge organizer, a great planner, and that's what actually the Franks owe the greatest part of their victories, aside from having good heavy cavalry at that point, because you can have lots of resources, but you also have to learn how to organize them. And the Carolingian Empire this did really great things. So, however, in spite of the influence of the Roman liturgy that is re-injected partly in the Frankish world, the changing from the ancient, let's say, from the early Christian liturgy is pretty evident at this point. In the Leonine, Gelasian and Gregorian sacramentary,s there was still this atmosphere of the Roman Empire, this thing of Constantine and Theodosius, and in Gelasian Mass instead, there is almost nothing more of strictly Roman. Let's leave aside the Latin, that naturally is something much worse at this point, because the Franks were ignorant like goats. Let's be honest about this. But so it is nothing to do with the classicism and all. But what's important here is the almost complete absence of the New Testament. This is what I want to stress, especially because the Franks were totally in love with the Old Testament for the reasons we have explained before. They were convinced to be the new chosen people of God. The Jews had thought they were the chosen people of God. The Romans had thought that they were the chosen people of God, or of the gods initially and of God afterwards. And these premises were very important because it was not so obvious in the ancient world. Like, you might think the Romans kind of fabricated that because they were, I don't know, at a certain point they had the empire and they began to feel that they had to conquer the world. But really, it's not just about that. The Romans had certain characteristics that made them extremely conscious that they had to conquer the world even before this happened. The Romans had a terrible mindset. I mean, terrible even in terrific, let's say, sense of the word. They won with that, the rule of the world. The Carolingians had these models in front of them that were naturally also literary models, because this time, these guys were Christian, but they also learned about Caesar, there was a big deal of interest towards the great pagan commanders of the past, and the Carolingians were inebriated by this. They loved these stories. They naturally believed that they were better than the Romans. This was proved by reality, according to them, because where were the Romans? The Romans had ruled over Gaul. Why was it then that it was the Franks then that ruled over Gaul now? It's because God had given them that. And this, especially from a Germanic perspective, was like ecstasy. The Franks believed that this is something they always had, that always remained part into France, I would say, as a general thing. I mean, the idea that there is only them, that it's France that has to rule all over. This started from Clovis. I mean, from the Franks from the time of Clovis, when Clovis created the empire, they didn't have any specific boundary they set themselves to. I mean, naturally, obviously, were stopped by the Goths and the Byzantines, etc. But they kind of, theoretically, they had to conquer everything, and this was not something so strange because the Franks had received the vicariate of the Gauls by the Roman emperors. Clovis had received purple mantle and the insignia. I mean, the Franks were obsessed since the beginning with the idea of being the successors of the Roman Empire in the West. It's not many people think this started with the Carolingians, but this is not true. This was extremely clear since the very beginning, and that's how the Merovingian dynasty had already built the whole political institutional system into Gaul, and that was eventually revived, reused by the Carolingians afterwards. So there was no point in here. It was not even a question about what the Franks had to do. They had to conquer the world. They had to be emperors, and that's why also they were so eager eventually also to take this role of protectors of the church and creating the holy, what would have become known as the Holy Roman Empire, because they thought it was their destiny. Charlemagne was pondering the imperial marriage with the Byzantine empress, or better, regent, because there couldn't be really an empress, Irene, and reuniting East and West. Just think about how history would have radically changed if Charlemagne and Irene had married and had, but not even had children yet, because that would have also changed a big deal. But also the only fact of essentially the Constantinople recognizing the Western Empire, which eventually they never did, by the way. And that instead the Carolingians and the Ottonians and all the other imperial dynasties of the West were actually so obsessed by, because and the Byzantines trolled them all the time, because they insulted these Germanic emperors by telling them substantially they were not emperors, and marrying their imperial princesses born in the Papal to peoples like, I don't know, the Russians or others, or even the Khazars or something like that, and not the Western Germanic Empire. Well, actually it happened eventually. The Ottonians intermarried with the Byzantine dynasty, but there were many. They were never recognized as peers of Constantinople. Neither through that. But what is important here is that in the Gelon's Mass, there is no trace of New Testament, and that the spirituality of these texts is wholly Old Testamentary. And what remains a bit more in line with the older Roman liturgy is the prayers and litanies for the emperor and the army, that were quite frequent, telling the truth. This is kind of, I think, has to do with, with the participation of the Frankish society to the wall, to the expeditions. To the idea that it was normal to see these men leaving for war every year, so that there was a sort of augural meaning attached to these prayers, so that be fine, be protected, my God be with you, and this could be used also from the previous literary models. Also, this was a problem as well. Which kind of literary models want to stick to? You already have these beautiful Roman ones. Why, producing something else in Francia where literature is so, and let's just use what we have in the past for that. For the broader thing, for the imperial dimension instead, for the imperial propaganda, it was the Old Testament that instead was firmly taken as a point of reference. There is also there is the Missa pro Rege contra Paganos, so the Mass for the king against the pagans in the Angulem sacramentary. This was we're talking about the roughly the I don't remember. We are essentially, I think, already in the 9th century. It's very influenced by the Gelasian models, by the way, but this was seemingly inspired by the Avaric war. So the invasion of the Avars on the Middle Danube in those years, and there is a very important concept that is the character of missionary war. So the idea that the war is not just something that happens for some secular reason, but that it has a strictly religious purpose, that is the one also of expanding the Christian empire. This had been actually a great concern of the same imperial ideology, and for the Carolingians it was important to recover it, because they wanted to stress how their empire in this sense was not, once again, a empire, was the empire, the Christian empire, and therefore expanding it, just like in the case of the Avars, that when the Avar Khaganate was destroyed, basically the Carolingians expanded into a wide area along the Danube that entered into contact also with other peoples, so areas that had remained pagan largely at that point. So they were seizing those lands, so we're seeing sort of promised land here as well, and lands into which Christianity now could spread under the Carolingian rule. In the following centuries, let's say in the 10th and the 11th century, there are also new models that have to do with the new models of liturgy, which are called the so-called crowning orders. So these were used both by emperors and kings. The first one, we know there are certain philological problems relatively to which one was to when they began. These crowning orders were written first. We think the first one might be already might date already to the 9th century, and it was called the Benedictio ad ordinandum imperatorem secundum occidentales. So this I wanted to check, by the way, this, because I think that this is referring to this is important because I got curious now about how the whole thing works. Let's see, because these other things are not easy to find. Let me check. This manuscript actually came from Germany, so this is interesting as well, because well, whatever. Now this is not important. I wanted to check one thing, but this time I don't have data for saying this, but let's say that it's important, however, that this was dated to the 9th century, because it already pertained to a moment to which, evidently, in spite of the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire, it was still very much felt the idea that the crowning was a moment of definition of the imperial dignity and prerogatives in many ways. So this was the crowning of the emperor was naturally a very important event, and it was a moment to which the emperor was entrusted through such texts from the church the task of defending the same church from and at the same time to triumph over the enemies that can be either they are of varied nature. They can be internal enemies, so rebels, or pagans as well. So this thing of the rebellions was kind of normal at this point, and the Carolingians had spent a big deal of conquering the empire, but also a lot of resources to kind of repress the rebellious peoples that had been incorporated into it, and naturally against the pagans, so that when the second invasions kick in, the Vikings, the Saracens, the Hungars, etc., these were all pagan, and naturally they were seen once again as this external threat, like a bit like it in the previous Roman say liturgies, so that there was even the conception of an external and of an internal world, especially before the very final collapse of the Carolingian Empire. So in a moment into which public authority still kind of functioned at long range, say functioned more or less, but still, having this. So it kind of fits also the 9th century, a large part of the 9th century as well, for the Carolingians. So what were these crowning orders really about? I mean, well, in practice they were a series of formulas, each one of which basically accompanied the conferment of a certain object that naturally symbolized the imperial power and or various imperial powers one by one. And there is an extremely important there is especially one that I think is very, very fascinating, that is the so-called gladi traditio, that is the conferment of the sword. So I think it's fine to read it, because it's very beautiful, also the way it's written. So this is from the Codex Vatican Latin 7114. It's published by Eichmann, Kirche und Staat, first volume in Quellensammlung zur kirchlichen Reichsgeschichte und zum Kirchenrecht, Paderborn, 1912. So if you're interested about that. Page 59. So here it says, accipe gladium per manus episcoporum licet indignes vice tamen et auctoritate sanctorum apostolorum consecratas tibi regaliter impositum nostraque benedictionis officia in defensionem sancte ecclesiae divinitus ordinatum et esto memor de quo psalmista prophetavit dicens accingere gladio tuo super femur tuum potentissime ut in hoc pereundum vim equitates excerses molemque iniquitatis destruas et sanctam Dei ecclesiam eiusque fideles propugnes ac protegas. So this is beautiful, actually, in Latin. So the translation I'm attempting now. So it's basically take the words, take the from the hands, take the sword from the hands of the bishops. That, in spite of kind of in not, let me check in English. How do you say that? In spite not worth of it, essentially unworthy, are however consecrated in the name and for the authority of the holy apostles. So the sword that is given to you as king, and it's been ordered by God under our benediction in defense of the Holy Church. And keep in mind what the psalmist prophesies. I think, let me check. Predicted for prophesies. Yeah, it can be said. When he said, bear, let's say a better verb, let's say bear the sword, or mighty, or most mighty, so that through this, that is the sword, you can exercise the force of justice, destroy the weight of injustice, to sustain and protect the Holy Church of God and her faithful. So this is very, very beautiful and very important, because it really stresses many things, actually. First of all, that there is this kind of thing of the idea that the church is itself, as a human society, is still imperfect. Here it says the hands of the bishop might be unworthy. This was an old business. Sorry, an old a vexata question, let's say, of the how were the bishops really worth as individuals. But this doesn't matter, because it's the hands of the bishops are just a mean. They are consecrated. So even if the bishop is a sinner, his hands are consecrated for the name and the authority of the holy apostles. So the sword that is given to you is by these hands. So you have to think this was read during the crowning. So it was a very spectacular thing. It was staged also in a certain way. The sword is given to you as ordered by God with our benediction in defense of the Holy Church. So this sword is not just a sword like another. It's the sword that the Church gives to you. Now, I don't know if you get how this is important at this point in history, because it means that it was the Church that was given the sword to the emperor. Now, this is essentially, in a nutshell, what the clash for investitures was all about. If you think it symbolically, who was that really conferred power to the emperor, because the Frank, I mean, yeah, we have seen how the Franks and the Church were kind of married at this point. The Church of Rome were married, but they were a bit of a, quarreling couple, because they, the Franks thought, as we were saying before, also because they had a church on their own. It was not the Roman one. I mean, they were recognizing the Roman authority, but just, up to a certain point. With all its limits, the Franks believed that their imperium, so their empire, had been entrusted to them by God since the very beginning. So what was really the church doing this? Stressing it, reinforcing it, or actually conferring it? Because this last thing, the latter was what the church believed. Rome, the popes were saying, okay, it's now you who give you this sword, and if you do not get it from us, you don't really have it, have you? I mean, yeah, you can wage war, etc., but also the pagans can wage war. Can be, do you remember the Leonine sacramentary said the same thing, where also the pagans can be strong, also the, say, unfaithful can be strong, but this doesn't make them holy and Christian. So it's as long as we, Roman Church, give you the sword, that you emperors can wield it. So naturally these ceremonies were, it would be interesting to study them all together to see how much they changed, and what kind of differences there were in these sacramentaries in the various areas of Carolingian Europe. It would be terribly fascinating to see whether there are different. I personally don't know. I'm sure there are people out there, so if you know something about it, please say it. I don't know how different these sacramentaries were in France, from Germany, or from Italy, because they all had a different approach to the thing, especially at this time, after the disgregation of the empire. And then it says, then here's it's quoting the Psalms, and which is actually stressing what the justice really should be about. The idea that divine justice comes through the sword, something comes straight from the Gospels, and so that the sword is not, people who rule on earth have always a sort of divine sanction at this point, and they really have, they're not put there in vain by God, even if they are bad rulers. This is also a very important thing that exists in the Christian tradition. So the sword is given so that through it the sovereign could exercise the force of justice. So this is the real problem. The who rules on earth has to ensure justice, had to enforce justice through the sword. And this is probably the greatest duty of the sovereigns. And together with this, you have to destroy injustice. You have to sustain and protect the Holy Church of God and its faithful. So this is a very serious commitment, a very serious responsibility. So you don't have to think it as, an arrogant thing to claim. It's actually a pretty heavy burden. And the relations with the Church in this sense were extremely important for the Carolingians, for all the other emperors, because they weren't simply a way to, naturally, especially the Ottonians, tried to control the Church, to kind of have, the thing solved the easy way. But most of the times, really, the Church was also antagonistic towards the empire. Under certain points of view, and still the emperors had to deal in a certain way towards that church, because this was also the problem, that that pope could be your enemy, could be even deposed, and but it's the whole church really that lives on besides that. So it doesn't stop there. Political practice at this point wasn't really disjuncted from religious matters. So it's complicated. Now maybe we skip this because I want to end finally at some point, but it's still very important to bear in mind. There is another beautiful so-called traditio ensis, so the another conferment of this word, as ensis in Latin is the hilt, so it's another way to call this word, through the hilt. And in this one, this is from a manuscript of Ivrea. Ivrea was the center of certain powerful dynasties in northwestern Italy that also participated to the imperial dignity. Sometimes they managed to be elected kings of Italy and emperors. And so this is also, and in here there is, we're not going to read it, but it's very nice, because the emperor is entrusted the task to defend the weak and the oppressed. There is another ordo that is contained in a codex from Paris, into which the sword comes once again into play as traditional dispenser of justice, and that is attributed to the justiciary, in fact. And in fact, the text says, accipe unc gladium ad vindictam malefactorum laudem vero bonorum. That is essentially, take take this sword to vindicate, to punish essentially the evildoers, and instead to and to praise, to in this sense to render justice, to honor the good people. And at the same time, the sword remains the instrument, naturally, the tool to win the enemies of these same sovereigns and of the adversaries of the church, in order to defend both the secular world but also the so-called castra dei. The castra dei, in this sense, is a metaphor to define the church. So all these, the castra would be the military settlements, and at this point it was full of, I don't know, monasteries, churches everywhere. This kind of gives it, because sometimes they were fortified as well, so it was not just a metaphor. The castrum was, everything that was walled at the time was arguably a fortress in some measure. At least it could work as such. So what can we get from this all, to conclude? So first of all, that from the Carolingian times, the warrior sacrality has kicked into Western Europe. The sacralization of the warrior is there. It's especially in Carolingian times, it's channeled through the ends of the church in some measure. So that this is important because it enters into the liturgical institution officially. So it's not something that is debated anymore. It's part of the practice. It's part of the liturgy, of the rites, of the prayers. So nobody actually contests that. And this is important because there is a Western world that at this point is kind of organizing itself in a different way from the Byzantine one, in competition with it, and with very different characters, because it's essentially the combination of this Germanic military mindset with the spiritual guidance of the Christian Church. So to the sovereigns is entrusted the task of tutors of justice, while dealing with the internal affairs of warriors proper against the pagans that at this point are perceived in the external areas, and of defenders of the church in both cases. What we have seen is naturally this geographical idea of Christianity is also pretty clear. In Roman times, this was at the times especially, this was still partly metaphorical, because it is true that the empire was only one and it was Christian, but at the same time there were still certain uncertainties, especially in the 4th century. It was plenty of still pagans in the empire. It's only in the 5th, at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th, to say that the Roman Empire become officially Christian, the pagans kind of disappear. But also before, the 6th century, a lot of pagan legacy was still out there, and especially in the West and in the East, in the 6th century, was Justinian essentially carried out this great final persecution of the pagans, closing even the school of Athens, the school of philosophy of Athens, persecuting the Jews, at least restricting their freedoms, etc. And even I don't remember now, but there was even some kind of very more violent restriction towards paganism in itself. I mean, in the West it was a bit different, but the point is, at that time, Christianity has still to spread. So the pagan world was much more widespread than and much more articulated. The time of Charlemagne, and even in post-Carolingian times, the Christianity was something much more geographically defined. Also because the Carolingians were exporting certain sedentary models into peoples that otherwise had not known that up to that point. That entailed the founding of bishoprics, of the organization of the local properties, certain administration, etc., that survived as a model also in post-Carolingian times. So it was pretty. It was also much greater degree of control, of religious control. The case of Saxony, this is pretty didactic as an example, as the Carolingians there struggled a lot to eradicate paganism at many levels, and the priests were used also as informers, etc. So it was a very political thing as well. So this idea of the outer world and the inner world was very much felt. It was reinforced by the second invasions, as the Vikings, the Saracens and the Magyars came from areas that evidently not Christian. At the same time, though, there is also a greater action towards within the same boundaries of the Christian society, because into these Carolingian sources, we start seeing the mention of the weak and the oppressed. So this is a very important alarm bell to spot that the same Carolingian society was about to collapse in some way. So that there were abuses, chaos, and that ultimately would bring to the crisis of public powers. So, let's say in at the times of Constantine or Theodosius, the mentioning of the sword used as, as a mean to use justice within the empire would have been something pretty strange, because in an ordered civil system, what was the point of using the sword against your own subjects? So we're not talking about the metaphorical swords of St. Paul's sword of the spirit, and nor the, or I don't know, the symbolical sword of justice, but a true sword. So the sword at this point had, the use of the sword within the same Christian society had to find a justification, so that it was not just used against the enemies of Christianity, but also to enforce justice within the same Christian world that evidently was pretty much troubled. And you noticed that in this time the sword is increasingly associated to the altar, and not just symbolically. It was actually blessed on the altar. It was used, it was handled, as we've seen before, by consecrated hands, like in the case of the conferment of the sword in the crowning orders. It was the bishops that gave physically the sword to the sovereign. So this is also important because it shows a world into which the bishops definitely were not criticized for even touching the sword. That was something that, I don't know, for instance, in Eastern Christianity would have been seen as very differently. At this time we know that bishops were basically all one with the military aristocracy. They came from the same military aristocracies, so sometimes they were also participating into combat, and it was actually pretty neat art. For instance, there are many figures, actually important literary figures, that were bishops, and they fought regularly in Carolingian times and Post-Carolingian times, naturally, and this remained for a great part of the Middle Ages, as a matter of fact. Just to say that these Romano-Germanic aristocracies were pretty forgetful of all the problems that were existing into the heirs of the Roman tradition in Constantinople, that instead stressed the complete extraneity of the clergy from any kind of earthly affair, at least especially certain ones, like, in fact, war and shedding blood, because shedding blood was a terrible sin. And I made a video on the penitentiaries, also in Western Europe at this time, but there is also in there a striking difference between what was prescribed into the Byzantine world, that was much more mindful of authorities like Saint Basil, etc., and what was happening in the West, where these societies were instead forfeiting a sort of number of kills for, of punishment for the number of kills, and etc. And they were kind of still telling the truth, dealing with killing as a very serious thing to do, very a sin for the Christian who performed that. But that was so habitual in that society that obviously had lost part of its terrible thing, in at least of how it was perceived in practice. And that's why before I stressed so much how, for instance, the Franks, as a Germanic people, liked so much the Old Testament where there is bloodshed all around, because they saw that as something more natural and more fitting with their own cultural sensitivity. So it's this has to be understood. Even the Crusades, from this point of view, have to be understood as a hybrid, a very special hybrid that was that had happened in the early medieval West, that saw definitely violence and killing as something different than what it had been in other times in the same areas, and that was also quite innovative, we can say, or I don't know how to say that, quite original, this is the word I wanted to use, compared to what how other societies had kind of found a compromise, because this is the real point. The West was still a hybrid between paganism and Christianism at this point, from a cultural point of view, which was different from the kind of full paganism of North and Eastern Europe. It was different from the statal models of Constantinople. Also radically different from Islam. Not radically maybe, but definitely were pretty different approaches to that. And this traditio gladi is especially very interesting. That especially kicks in from the 10th century, despite we've seen was present also from the 9th. And what is more important probably is that this traditio gladi doesn't stop to the sovereigns, so to the leaders of society, but it's getting spread all over, at all the levels of society, and with, by the way, together with the spread of other symbols, dignities, prerogatives that were, however, passing still through a hierarchical channel. Especially the idea that authority is something that came from the above, so from God to the sovereigns, to the vassals, to the bands of thugs that were made up the retinues of the smaller lords, was somehow conferred. And so this was this logical adoption from the inferior strata of societies of cultural models that were actually offered by the elites in many ways. And this is where we touch the topic of cavalry, because definitely the 10th century is arguably the most important time, at least this is the moment into which really the concept of miles, that is the knight, gets formed. Because everything that came later was essentially a strengthening of the concepts that were formed at this point. And especially, we're not talking about because the milites, as miles in Latin, it means simply not properly soldier. It would be soldier actually, also etymologically speaking, because it was the one that received the pay for that. But up to a certain also this is very complex actually as to say, but what is important is that with the fragmentation of the public authority, there were lots of people who were invested as milites at this point locally, and sometimes even autonomously from public appointment, or at least it was always something very deeply felt also from a public point of view, a religious point of view, but it was spreading at other levels of society. So that if you live in in a place in France that is just ravaged by the Viking invasions, you don't really stop waiting for the sword of your sovereign. You start wielding swords on your own, and still these communities needed a sort of formal sanction of this. There is a video I made now that I think about it, you can find it into the Medieval France playlist that is titled, I think, Gerald of Aurillac and Secular Holiness, something like that. It actually discusses this. I mean, how the knight, the lord, the armed retinue of the Lord was seen as a sort of rightful presence to ensure safety, and how the sacralization of the warrior was a way to protect society. Because that wasn't fighting, those guys weren't allegedly at least weren't fighting for themselves, but for protecting society as a whole. And this is very actually debatable, because both things existed. Like it's all about, this is all concerning the spread of the of feudalism and how feudalism was born. It was at the time a legitimization, at the same time an abuse, and it's very difficult to find the boundary in here. So paradoxically, it was also a measure of self-legitimization from the same elites, like the nobility as it was being formed at this point really stressed indeed its own holiness in intent as fighters of Christian fighters, and not just as robbers or people who just wanted to expand their own domains, and that's it. So, but it was still important that the Christian element is present, because it means that the society still needed that kind of legitimization, in part because the power of these lords was not really unlimited. So there was definitely some delegation involved, and a lot of the ceremonial of the liturgical ceremonies were that we have seen today were used in part also to evolve towards the ones of the knight investitures, which, by the way, also in here were not inspired just by liturgy, but were something that existed actually already into paganism, like the initiatic warrior ceremonies of the pagan Germanic world were also something that contributed to build up the ceremonies of investiture, of the knight's investiture in later times. So and even that those ceremonies brought with them a form of spirituality that blended in with the Christian one at this time. So you can argue that such practices were nothing really new, that were just being redefined in some way and stressed once again, especially because this society was getting more stratified, especially in certain areas that had not known a great development. And like if you take Germany, was a place where this problem had not really been so great, because everybody was a freeman and everybody was a warrior up to a certain point. There weren't many social differences. Then at a certain point the Carolingians come, they stratify society, and they need and this society worked with certain people who fought and certain people who didn't, even though this is also a bit of an approximation, especially in the first centuries. But let's say that it was a much great deal of emphasis placed on the individual bellator, the fighter, as a knight, the one who could have a horse and an armor that other people had to work for. See the peasants, and were under the lord, indeed. So it was a way, as we were saying before, also to self-aggrandize the same noble class that was being formed in this very time, pretty transversely all over post-Carolingian Europe. And in this sense recognizing itself also across transnational boundaries. And it's only, however, during the 12th and the 13th century that the knight's investiture will be formally regulated and, let's say, in a kind of a stereotypical form. This time everything was even much more informal than we think, but still it was so because the society kind of accepted it, or at least allowed it in some form. And it could be pretty easy to appoint someone knight in the early days, or simply starting to behave as one and being recognized as such eventually. So what is important in here, in my opinion, is mostly stressing the moment of transition of the collapse of the Carolingian public power that I discussed so much in Schwerpunkt, because it's really the moment into which also those mentions of tutelage, of justice, defense of the church, and protection of the weak are passed from the kings to the knights, given the kings were getting weaker. Naturally, eventually the king at a certain point keep rising once again. Just recently I made a video that was the construction of the new feudal monarchies between the 11th and the 12th century, to which I discussed this paradox, that the lower feudal monarchies actually evolve from this even feudal and system that had been the same one that had previously fragmented the public authority. So also inheriting all its the military edus of the knights into the kings as well. You can argue that previously to the 10th century, obviously, I don't know, Carolingian king had to be a warrior as well, but it was not really the same thing of being a knight like in the 13th century. You know, a lot had really changed. The first model was more than else the one of the Germanic chieftain, was still a primus inter pares, a sort of freeman on his own regard. In the 13th century, you know, the king has to be a knight also because the knight was something more than the average fighter. He was a warrior of God. There's a lot of difference actually. And so, as you can imagine, naturally, and as I believe everybody knows, most of this Christian, let's say, most of this military commitment was involved in actually fighting other Christians, as you know, if you take post-Carolingian Europe, all the wars against these lords, neighboring lords, constantly fighting against each other, and therefore they weren't really that happy about you know, they were not so concerned about just fighting the pagans, with whom sometimes they even allied themselves, but rather to contain and to. So this is trans-religious, really. This has to do with politics and war. Naturally, the word religious, I mean, it was a big deal of fight against the invading peoples at the time as well, but when they went away, those came every once in a while. The rest of the time it was just Christians fighting against each other, which is, however, fine in the sense that we have seen how justice had to be enforced also into Christian society through the sword. Too bad that wasn't really about justice but about personal gain, but this is how the whole history always worked, so there is nothing to be surprised of. So the chivalric edicts was in a certain sense created accordingly, also in here, as a simplification of the royal duties. It's as if these knights took all a bit their share of royal prerogatives and exercise them for themselves. And so this naturally, once again, we repeat, it was born theoretically to put an end to disorder. But this disorder was mostly caused by the same knights and lords, say better. And so the great winner in this really was instead the church, in part. Why? Because also the church naturally suffered of this disorder, and was actually protected by the public authority. This is interesting because the church, as we've said many times in the Schwerpunkt, was the one that the entity that was probably the most centralized entity existing in this time. Despite it was fragmented as well, but by degree it was, and therefore they had everything to lose from chaos. So even when public authority collapsed, the church in a certain sense inherited part of the role of pacifier against all these extremely unruly nobility that spent time fighting against each other, and also invested in this sense the ecclesiastical domains. By the way, were also defended and expanded through military retinues as well. As we said before, bishops and abbots often fought themselves. But in this sense, the church had to rule over something greater, something that required also patrimonially speaking, a higher degree of organization. So this chaos was detrimental to that, and that's why partly the church managed to, at least was on the foreground in trying to stem such violent behaviors. That's why the pieces of God and the truces of God are strongly advocated by the church, because they also were, in absence of the public authority, were also sometimes part of the legitimizing authority in there. So the sacralization of the knight was something that had necessarily to pass through the church at this point. It wasn't anymore a pagan rite. It was something that had to be enforced by the church as well. Also through the help of the few public authority that was left. So all these chivalric ideal of the knight that defends the weak, the oppressed, etc., is something that is pretty much strengthened at this time to try to address the milites towards a more edifying direction, and that's partly how also the Crusades were born in the end, because that's surely a factor. The idea of sending these young cadets of the seigneurial families to vent their juvenile instincts somewhere else than locally. So, leaving for the Holy Land, Spain, the Baltic, etc. Okay, I think for now, maybe I can just stress how important this was for the spirit and the culture of the West. All this because these ideals, however, survived to the ages. The idea that protecting the weak and the oppressed is something noble, something good. Something we still have in part, and it really dated back to these traditions, to these worlds that were still transforming, still defining, and that yet identified this broad reason of rule of pacification to be the most important thing after all. In spite of the hypocrisy, in spite of the contradictions, in spite of the of the difference between theory and practice, but that's what they left us. And I think this is important because it tells us probably that not that I feel much for these kind of civil things, because it is true these times sucked really. Was a lot of violence, etc. But I think, and this is a bit, I interpret history most of the times like this, essentially, that there's always been a sort of push for keeping society together at many levels, because it's not just really about the sheer sufferance of people. It's really also about trying to make something better. And even if maybe you're not directly involved into this, which however is not the case here, because these elites were all about conflict and political and military affairs, doesn't matter whether they were lay or ecclesiastics, but they still, however, tried to solve the thing. Another interesting thing is that public authority never actually, yeah, it was passed, it was handed down to someone, it split, but it was still there. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire didn't really bring to an end of public prerogatives. Yeah, okay, these existed also in pre-Carolingian times, so it's pretty obvious, but this is the point I'm trying to make, is that human societies have to, however, find an equilibrium of some sort, or at least an acceptable way of in trying to solve the problems. And therefore I realized that from our moral standards it's very difficult to understand how this was done, in part, but there is still the tiny bit that actually is matching with our morals in part, and from which our same morals partly stem. So this is what I wanted to leave you with. It's just a reflection, it's not really an answer I give you, it's just more, just think about that, because it's kind of interesting. But however, so very long video, very long video, and so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe